Is there anything better in sports than when the best in the world take on the best in the world? Recently in the UFC, the battle between Alexander Volkanovski and Islam Makhachev was literally the pound for pound two best fighters going head to head to see who's number one.
There can be only one.
When the pound for pound number one fighter on the planet has truly been tested, it's made for some of the most exciting and legendary fights of all time. I'm Balian from MMA On Point. Thank you to all our amazing Hall of Famers out there for supporting us. Now sit down as we're going to track through the years of MMA history and look at every single time the pound for pound number one was tested. So the first year we are starting at is in 1993. Why? Now this is the first year a few things happened. It was the year Pancrase began. It was also of course the year that the UFC had their first event, and a lot of other promotions before that, well, they were kind of hit and miss. The Japanese promotion Rings was still just having a bunch of fake fights, and Cejudo, well, it turned out to be a great promotion, but it was still only getting started. That being said, in 1993, one guy had emerged from that promotion seemingly light years ahead of everybody else. The first pound-for-pound fighter was a guy called Noboru Asai. Also, I do have to say, at different points in time, you can make an argument for several people being the pound-for-pound number one. So when that is the case, I'm just going to mention them all, okay? But in 1993, at 9-1, it was pretty hard to argue the best guy around wasn't Noboru. He was just 25 years old, the featherweight Shooto champion, and he had a pretty nasty armbar. I mean, look at this shit right here. This is what he was doing to people. Noboru was on a free fight armbar streak when he ran into another early Japanese MMA legend, Yuki Nakai. At just 23, Nakai gave Noboru all he could handle. Where the champ had just cut through other fighters, these two were very competitive. They traded back and forth positions, attack submissions, it went the distance, and all 5 rounds. But the pound for pound number one fighter, Noboru, stayed on top. His win streak continued for about another 3 years until he actually lost to Royler Gracie, and Yuki Nakai wouldn't lose again until he fought Rickson Gracie many years later. Just goes to show how good both guys were. But of course, by the end of 1993, UFC 1 happens. Royce Gracie shows what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is all about, and he is now the new pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. As we go into 1994. Things start off with Royce winning UFC 2 in March, and then in September running into adversity for the first time. Quite surprisingly, against basically an untrained bodybuilder called Kimo Leopoldo. Now the guy was just massive though, and Royce really struggled to put him away. At one point, he was just getting completely squashed by this giant guy. He managed to win, but barely, and he had to withdraw from the tournament. But that wasn't the worst of it Royce faced that year. A much tougher test awaited in the finals of UFC 4 a few months later. Dan the Beast 7. Now this guy was a skilled wrestler and also much bigger than Royce, and Dan ended up just doing everything he could to try and negate the Gracie game. His body just loomed over Royce and he grinded on him for 15 very sweaty minutes. Once again though, Gracie's jiu-jitsu proved it could work on just about anybody. It was really though the first time anyone doubted if the Gracies were going to win, and definitely a struggle for old Roycey boy. But of course that takes us through to 1995, where the triple UFC champ Royce is pound for pound still number one. But that's when an old foe comes back into the picture, Ken Shamrock. Now these two guys fought at UFC 1, obviously they faced off against each other on the poster, but never got to fight at UFC 3 as both guys pulled out. But by the time of UFC 5, Ken was now also the openweight Pancrase champion and had just submitted Bas Rutten in 1 minute. So at UFC 5, the first fight that wasn't part of a tournament ever was booked. So first off, there was no time limit because the Gracies hated time limits, but that meant the fight ended up going for 36 minutes. And although it was pretty boring, Ken Shamrock took Royce down and just laid on top of him. It showed that if you had good enough defense, BJJ just wasn't enough to win a fight on its own. And Royce was also stuck on the bottom, and it just made him look pretty human. Now, because there also weren't judges, this fight was just called a draw, but if there had been, well, you would have given it to Ken Shamrock. He was on top the whole time, and he was the guy landing strikes, and he busted Royce open. From every metric, damage, control, Ken won. Royce's jiu-jitsu didn't work, he couldn't submit the guy. And for those reasons, that's why Ken Shamrock was seen as the number one pound for pound guy, and he was the guy that would go on and continue to fight for super fight championships in the UFC. After this as well, Royce Gracie won't fight for another 5 years. Now this all happened in April of 1995, and guys, just 1 month later, Ken then goes back to Pancrase, looked at by a lot of people as the new #1 pound-for-pound guy, and loses his Pancrase championship to Suzuki in just 2 minutes. Okay, UFC 5 was supposed to have been for the first proper UFC title, and Pancrase is just out here submitting their best. Just a few months after that though, Bas Rutten and Suzuki meet for a second time in Pancrase to fight for the title, and after a 15-minute war, Bas slaps on a guillotine and becomes the new king, and he holds onto that belt and he never loses it. So by the end of the year, Hughes has gone, Ken Shamrock has lost, and it's pretty much just Bas Rutten as the pound-for-pound best, and next year he gets a proper test of that title. So let's go to 1996. This is about the time where everyone starts to take notice of Japan and Pancrase a little bit more, as that's where the new #1 pound-for-pound fighter is. Bas Rutten starts the year off by finishing 2 more guys, making his win streak now 9. And there was really only one guy left who could test him at this point, Frank Shamrock. While Bas was out injured, Frank had become undeniable as a challenger, winning the interim Pancrase title. He and Bas were 1-1. It had to happen, and so Pancrase scheduled a trilogy matchup with the belt on the line. Meanwhile, in the UFC, Dan Severn has been winning without any real competition around, and the same month Bas and Frank had their trilogy fight, he actually split decisions Ken Shamrock after another 30-minute war. Back to Bas and Frank, they have one hell of an awesome fight, scrambling after each other, throwing submissions up, throwing big strikes and punches. I mean, the pace was so high in this one, the cardio was tested, and Rutten was also just tested in every way you can imagine. Both guys had to constantly stay vigilant to avoid each other's rapid submission attempts, and Bas Rutten ended up just smacking a smiling Frank Shamrock in the face over and over again. With his superior power though, he forced Shamrock to quit after 11 minutes. Test passed, and Bas Rutten is still the pound-for-pound best. For the rest of the year, Bas, again, isn't really challenged, and by September, his next title defense against Funaki turned into a massacre, with Bas just plastering him all over the ring. And he is actually probably the last high-level opponent that Rutten goes up against for the next few years. But that's the end of this year, on to 1997. So at this point, you might have Bas Rutten at the top of your pound-for-pound list. Like I said, these rankings have always been very much unofficial, and we're trying to do this back in 1997. But either way, Bas is not tested this year. But back over in the UFC, there's another fighter on the rise who looks like the future of the sport, just an American hero by the name of Randy Couture. So at UFC 13 in May, a tournament begins to find a new contender for the UFC Heavyweight Championship. In just 4 minutes, a decorated collegiate wrestler, Randy Couture, shows up, smashes through Tony Holm and Stephen Graham, and looks like the perfect blend of wrestling, striking, and dirty boxing that an MMA fighter in 1997 needs. Also on the other side of the coin in 97, you had Vitor Belfort on a 4-fight knockout streak. He was the same as Randy, just blending jiu-jitsu with his striking. 2 of the first proper MMA fighters, and when they went head-to-head at UFC 13, Randy beat him down after 8 minutes of action. Vitor had been looked at with such potential and promise that win alone was enough to catapult Randy to the top of a lot of people's lists for best fighter in the world. Without question, Randy Couture was going to fight for the heavyweight title next. Now the kickboxer Maurice Smith was champion. He was the guy who'd tired out the Hammer Mark Coleman and ended the reign of the first UFC heavyweight champ. But in this fight, Randy showed off his control, and the game plan was basically to smother Smith for the whole fight. But Maurice was obviously trained for that. He had really good defense, and it limited what Randy was able to do. He'd run through everyone else easily, even Vitor comparatively. But it wasn't easy, and it took 21 minutes to win a majority decision, and Randy was named the UFC heavyweight champion. So it could be Randy as pound-for-pound #1 at this point. It could still be Bas. In fact, they were both supposed to fight each other for the UFC title at this point. Randy, though, had a contract dispute and ended up dropping the title and flying all the way to Vale Tudo, Japan. And that takes us into 1998. The Japanese debut of Randy is a must-watch for MMA fans. How would the American champ do overseas? The answer, not great. The UFC heavyweight champion gets submitted by Enson Inoue.
Felt like everybody was looking at me, and I was the guy who was supposed to win that fight, and everybody expected big things from me, and I don't think I dealt with that.
Randy managed to get the takedown right away, but I don't think he'd been on the ground with someone as strong and as skilled as Enson was. He got up out of his guard, and then he just wasn't really sure what to do.
He surprised me with the amount of power he was able to generate from the mat.
Randy used his Greco to get another takedown, but he left his arm out there and Enson took it.
I tried to pull away, MMA, which is exactly what you don't want to do.
So Randy Couture at this point loses any argument he has to be at the top of the pound-for-pound rankings. Although Bas Rutten in Pancrase is still undefeated, he's not fought for a title in over 2 years. And so many argued that the number one spot deserved to go to another guy who was back in the UFC. Just 1 week before Randy's Japanese debut, Frank Shamrock, the guy who tested the pound-for-pound best in 1996, makes his third UFC title defense and is now being called the best fighter on the planet. In fact, the year before this, Frank had just blasted Enson Inoue, the guy that just beat Randy. Shamrock, though, isn't properly tested in the UFC until we get to 1999, where we get to see probably one of the best MMA fights of the 90s take place. In just a short amount of time in the UFC, Tito managed to build himself an incredible amount of hype. He'd started beef with Shamrock's Lion's Den team, and there weren't really that many rivalries back then, so it got a lot of attention from the fans. And then in September, he was given a title shot against the UFC's best, Frank Shamrock. So Tito came into the fight as the inexperienced young kid, but early on was able to take Frank down over and over again. He even opened up a cut. But Frank weathered the storm, and by the end of the third round, Tito had slowed a lot.
That's not to say Tito's still not dangerous here, but it's definite now that his output has started to dwindle.
Still, Tito grabbed one last desperate takedown, but it wasn't looking good. Frank got back up to the feet and unloaded on Tito as he dove to the ground and eventually just couldn't get up anymore. What did people think of Frank after that performance?
And you are the greatest champion to ever grace the octagon, the greatest champion in our history.
Now, of course, just a few months before this, Bas Rutten had fought Kevin Randleman, and that had been a really tough test as well. He was controlled, had his nose broken, and didn't really look like the greatest martial artist of all time that he was billed as. He had to push hard for a very close decision. Now, people still debate that decision to this day, but it means at this point, either through his retirement or through that fight, he was no longer the number one pound for pound. And then, in another twist of fate, just 1 month after this title defense, Frank Shamrock drops the UFC title and walks away from the promotion, leaving them without the two best fighters in the world. Either way, going into 2000, everything was about to change. Pride Fighting Championships had already been running for about 3 years, but in the year 2000, they put on one of the biggest tournaments of all time, the Pride Openweight Grand Prix. It was enough of a spectacle to get one of the previous pound-for-pound greats back. Royce Gracie hadn't competed since his super fight draw against Ken Shamrock at UFC 5. We just had UFC 20 at this point, but he had still never lost in any promotion. Meanwhile, Pride had started to grow their own superstar, Sakuraba. Thousands of fans desperately watched the tournament unfold until Sakuraba and Hughes met in the quarterfinals and had an incredibly epic fight with no time limit. Both men were pushed to their absolute limits. Sakuraba was using the gi against Hughes, and it became way more of a battle of mental toughness. After 90 minutes and 6 15-minute rounds, Hughes simply couldn't continue, and Sakuraba, by de facto, became the new greatest pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. He'd already beaten 2 Gracies, Vitor Belfort, and won a UFC tournament. This cemented him at the top. And then Saku was immediately challenged about 2 hours later by Igor Vovchanchin. Now, Sakuraba was obviously completely fucking knackered and could have slept for 2 weeks, and it was on the same night, so they had to call the fight after the first round because, yeah, he still somehow made it 15 minutes. But considering Igor was up a weight class and what Saku had just done for an hour and a half, no one held the withdrawal against him. Now, that of course all happened in May, but Sakuraba was just getting started in the year 2000. In August, he did something incredible, submitted another Gracie, Henzo, and by December, he'd beaten yet another one, Hein Gracie. An incredible year for Sakuraba, who ended 2000 as pretty much undisputedly the pound-for-pound #1 guy in MMA. But, of course, immediately from the start of 2001, things did not go his way. Meanwhile, while Pride had been celebrating the achievements of a homegrown star in Sakuraba, they had been feeding a monster knockouts, Wanderlei Silva. By March of 2001, he was unbeaten in 6 Pride fights and just couldn't be denied any longer. And so he squared off with the pound-for-pound king, Sakuraba. Now, to be fair, I think Tito Ortiz actually cursed Sakuraba by giving him a kiss before this one started.
Don't worry, folks. Tito's married. No problems there. That would be very scary, man, if he would be...
But the guy nicknamed the Axe Murderer, yeah, he was not there to play around. Sakuraba was always full of surprises, and as Wanderlei came out trying to kill him, actually, Saku dropped him first. But that definitely pissed him off, because 30 seconds later, Vandy was blasting him with soccer kicks.
Sakuraba's going to be knocked out. He's going to be knocked out.
And just like that, The pound-for-pound best was defeated by vicious TKO. Now, like I just said, if you beat the number one guy, it doesn't automatically always make you pound-for-pound number one. It's usually sustained success across a period of time. That night that Sakuraba was knocked out, he could no longer be called king, but Wanderlei had literally just lost the year before to Tito Ortiz in the UFC. No, it wasn't until the end of the year that Rodrigo Nogueira emerged as the new top guy. He'd had an amazing 2000 where he rang through the Rings King of Kings tournament, and throughout 2001 he'd beaten some of the biggest heavyweight names like Gary Goodridge and Mark Coleman, who just won that Pride 2000 Grand Prix. After Sakuraba had been beaten, Big Nog also then ended the year as the first ever Pride heavyweight champion. So that's your new pound for pound best right there at the end of 2001. Just out of interest though, what was happening in the UFC in 2001? Well, not much really. It was kind of the dark ages. Tito was defending his light heavyweight belt after the loss to Frank Shamrock, and that was about it. Which brings us to 2002, where the pound for pound best is once again put through the ringer, but not against a top contender, but in a spectacle fight. Pride booked Bob Sapp, an ex-NFL player, to step in the ring against their heavyweight pound for pound champion. And at this stage, Bob was terrifying. He had done some scary things in his very short time in MMA. This was long before he started flopping fights, and Bob Sapp threw the champion Nogueira around the ring for the first half of the fight. Big Nog was in big trouble, and really only his toughness helped him survive long enough to pull off an incredible submission after a dramatic fight that no one thought would play out that way.
Unbelievable, guys. Absolutely unbelievable.
Freaking unbelievable was right, mate. The amount of punishment he took in that fight, it only made Nogueira look even more unbeatable. But then we found out in 2003 that was not the case. Pride scheduled his first official heavyweight title defense against another new heavyweight contender, just this Sambo master called Fedor Emelianenko. Now, this was the early days of the last emperor. He'd yet to establish himself as one of the best in the world. He'd only won 2 fights in Pride, but even so, his skill set was so undeniable they gave him a shot at the pound for pound best. The BJJ champion was always comfortable on his back in his guard, and that's where Fedor ended up, and it seemed at first like a bad idea for the challenger.
You should have stand up. You should have never gone into the yard of Nogueira.
Because this is where Nogueira wants him.
Fedor started dropping incredible punishment with his ground and pound.
He's got him stunned here. Fedor, the crowd is going ballistic here.
It seemed like Nogueira just couldn't keep taking those shots, but he did. For 25 minutes as the last emperor looked incredible.
There's no question Fedor has taken the title.
Fedor was the heavyweight champion, but probably not the new pound for pound best. Like I said, he was just getting started. When Leon Edwards head kicked Usman, he didn't immediately become the number one pound for pound guy. We're going to get to that later. It means in 2003, we need to go back to the UFC, where a new man had risen, and with Big Nog defeated, he stood out as the most dominant champ in MMA at the time. UFC welterweight champion Matt Hughes. Going into the new year, Matt had already got 3 title defenses under his belt, but the UFC brought in pretty much the toughest guy they could, Sean Sherk. The dude was 19-0, and he and Matt squared off in April. And we saw Hughes get taken down for the first time and even get controlled for the majority of some of the rounds. It turned into a real war of attrition that Matt Hughes managed to freaking win, defending his pound for pound spot, and if anything proving he deserved it even more because Sean Sherk had been this undefeated force. Now, I do suppose if you wanted to make the argument that Tito was maybe the pound for pound best at the time, well, okay. But that year, Teets would finally fight Randy Couture in September, and he got spanked, definitively ending his title reign. But in November, something far too glorious happened, and it knocked Matt Hughes off the pound for pound spot. In one night, Wanderlei Silva collided with Hidehiko Yoshida in the fight of the year, and then knocked out Rampage Jackson to win the 2003 Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. It was seen as an incredible achievement on top of a win streak that began with him knocking out Sakuraba, winning the Pride Middleweight Championship, and then after he TKO'd Quinton Jackson, who himself had just taken out Chuck Liddell, it made it 18 fights unbeaten in Pride for Wanderlei. In that one night, Wanderlei Silva climbed to the top of most people's pound for pound list. Now, meanwhile, of course, Fedor's career in Pride is getting more impressive with every victory, and he'd racked up 4 of them by the end of the year after beating Nogueira. But again, they weren't against the best heavyweights in the world. Not yet, and though he did face some adversity that year as well in his fight with Kazuyuki Fujita.
Oh my God!
In 2003 though, Fedor was just getting started. And so the next time the pound for pound best is tested is in 2004. At this point, I suppose the UFC have just run out of competition for Matt Hughes. He's wiped the welterweight division out. And it just so happens that a former lightweight contender was ready to come back to the UFC, and I'm talking about BJ Penn. The prodigy, as he had been called, he was incredibly hyped by the fans, but no one gave him a chance against Matt Hughes, upper weight class. But from the opening bell, Hughes was attacked by BJ, who went out there and then submitted the champ in the first round in an incredible performance. And so Matt Hughes' argument to be at the top of the pound for pound list was officially over. On that New Year's Eve, Wanderlei Silva was supposed to once again fight Sakuraba, but he had pulled out at the last minute, and Vandy agreed to an open weight bout against the 70-pound heavier Super Samoan Mark Hunt. It was only his third ever MMA fight, and he was going in there with the pound for pound best. Wanderlei, shit, even the UFC champ Randy Couture was there handing out the flowers.
What would be your strategy, Randy, in a situation like this?
You'd be the fastest double leg you ever saw in your life.
Now, Vandy didn't want to stand with the kickboxing Grand Prix champion Hunt and managed to take him down, but Mark kept getting up, and then he was dropping Silva.
Up, and he knocked Silva down with that left hand.
At the start of the second, it looked like he was going to finish him.
Oh, uppercut! That hurt him! That hurt him!
He's on the ground! Oh, the gun has hurt Wanderlei Silva!
He survived the entire ordeal, and it went to a judge's decision, and after 18 fights unbeaten in Pride, he'd taken a gamble, and it didn't pay off. Mark Hunt was named the winner. Just 15 minutes later, the New Year's Eve main event walked out. A rematch again for the heavyweight title between Fedor and Nogueira. Now, Big Nog had managed to recapture his status as one of the best when he submitted Cro Cop for the interim title earlier on in the year and then climbed to the top of the 2004 heavyweight Grand Prix. Fedor and Nog had then clashed quite literally a few months earlier, and because of a cut, they'd rebooked it for New Year's Eve, and the hype was just insane. This time around, Fedor was just throwing Nogueira around the ring and tagging him with big shots. He beat him up pretty badly. But because, again, Nogueira has this insane chin, he kept swinging back until the very end, and it went to a decision. But again, Fedor was just undeniable and was officially crowned on New Year's Eve as the pound-for-pound #1 guy. But everybody already knew who his next challenge was going to be going into 2005. Along with MMA at the time, Japan also had a massive kickboxing scene. K1, it brought together fighters from Japan, Oceania, America, and European countries like Holland, France, and Croatia for some incredible tournaments. Winning one of these things meant you were literally one of the most badass men alive, and along with Mark Hunt, Mirko Cro Cop had been head-kicking people unconscious in kickboxing and started doing it in MMA. He'd lost a Big Nog for the interim title, sure, but was already on another 7-fight win streak, and a date with Destiny and Fedor, the pound-for-pound best, awaited in 2005. This turned out to be not just the fight of the year, but the actual fight of the decade. This was a dangerous matchup for Fedor. Make no mistake, both guys, if anyone made one error, it could be over.
Nice! Again, the great counter to that left kick.
And both guys were just throwing missiles at each other.
And now he has him on the rope spot. But now with that high left, almost has Cro Cop.
Cro Cop even then split Fedor open. Slowly but surely though, the last Emperor just kept wearing down Cro Cop until the last 30 seconds where in front of the world, both guys were exhausted, covered in blood, and still trying to take each other's heads off. When it was all over though, the baddest man on the planet was still on top. And for the next few years, the pound-for-pound champ isn't really tested. Fedor picked up 2 more wins in 2006, but over Mark Coleman and Mark Hunt, 2 guys who just weren't really able to challenge the champ. And then by the end of the year, Pride had closed down. Fedor was still looked at as the best in the world, but he just wasn't fighting the best heavyweights in the world anymore, and that kind of continued right up till 2010. Back in the UFC during this time, 2 more potential pound-for-pound greats had started to emerge from the pack. The legends Anderson Silva and George St. Pierre. Now, who you consider the pound-for-pound #1 at this point is kind of up to you. George, going into 2010, had a pretty good case. Already at 3 title defenses, he'd beaten top contenders like Koscheck, John Fitch, and at UFC 100 defended his belt against Thiago Alves. St. Pierre was only looking more impressive, and he made it all look so easy. So if you did have him as pound-for-pound #1, well, he'd not really been challenged while he held the title, not since Matt Serra, and he wasn't the pound-for-pound best back then. And regardless, by the end of 2009, I mean, a lot of people thought the new pound-for-pound king was Anderson Silva. In just 3 years, the Spider had taken over the UFC, 8 finishes in a row before Thales Leites finally took him to a decision, and that's only because Anderson had kind of just played with him. After Pride had shut down, Silva fought the last middleweight champion Dan Henderson in the UFC, and he finished him in the second round. Now that was enough right there for some people to put him at pound for pound number 1, but not just that. Because by the end of 2009, the Spider had also gone up to light heavyweight for a second time and just completely dusted Forrest Griffin, okay? As everybody said, it looked like something out of the Matrix. And all of that continued into 2010. Fedor's time at the top of the pound-for-pound list just comes crashing down. Without Pride, Emelianenko went to Affliction. After they folded, he went to Strikeforce, and although he had a bit of a struggle with Brett Rogers, he was still looking like the dominant version of himself. That was until Fedor was matched up with Fabricio Verdum, an ex-UFC fighter who was KO'd on his way out of the promotion. But he was a BJJ master who started a win streak in Strikeforce and was ready to shock the world.
It's a classic striker versus grappler matchup, and Fedor says he has the formula for beating Verdum quickly.
Now this one would be over quickly, but not in the way most people expected.
Here's a chance for Verdum to take a huge step forward and send shockwaves through the sport of MMA with a win.
In just 30 seconds, Fedor had thrown hands and dropped Fabricio, but it was exactly what the BJJ black belt wanted. Fabricio Verdum threw up his legs and locked in a triangle, and just like that, with a single dejected tap, the 31-fight unbeaten streak was over. So then, after July 2010, it was clear that Anderson Silva was now king of all men. But just 3 months after Fedor's loss, the Spider would face his own test, in the form of a brash, trash-talking American wrestler who was coming for everything he had.
You know, I've been calling this guy out for 4 years, and he still doesn't want to fight me. I'm going to take his belt, I'm going to hurt him real bad in 2 days.
Not just that though, Chael Sonnen was calling his whole status as the pound-for-pound number 1 into question.
He fought a one-legged Canadian, he fought a math teacher from Ohio.
Who's he beating the UFC that's even held their spot within the roster, 2 or 3 guys?
Now this fight is an absolute classic. In fact, it made it into the UFC Hall of Fame. Chael comes out with no fucks given, and in 30 seconds, boom, hits Anderson with a left hand and rocked him. What happened next was just pure wrestling domination, with the pound-for-pound great spending 16 out of the next 20 minutes of his fight on his back, eating punishment from Sonnen. The beating continued until there was just 2 minutes left on the clock. The Spider's legacy was about to come crashing down, but he threw up a Hail Mary submission and somehow got the tap. One of the most dramatic endings to a fight ever, and the pound-for-pound best was pushed perhaps more than any fight so far in this video and was still able to win. And although these two did eventually run it back, it turned out to be far from the challenge of the first encounter. In fact, Anderson Silva is never really challenged again, or at least for a few more years. It's really between him and GSP at this point, but he also doesn't face any major tests until 2013. Before we talk about those two though, we have to mention that in those 3 years since the Sonnen Silva fight, a new elite UFC champion had also arisen. This was the time of John Jones. In 2011, he won the light heavyweight title and then defended it 4 times by the time 2013 rolls around, basically putting himself right up there as one of the best pound for pound. While GSP and Anderson were still around though, that was always going to be debated. Silva's title defense was up first in July, and basically with only one tough fight in his 7-year reign as champion, the pound for pound best was about to fall at the hands of a relatively inexperienced fighter. Chris Weidman, the All-American grappling standout, had the most important thing needed to beat the Spider: confidence. He wasn't thrown off by Anderson's intimidating antics, and he brought the same energy to that fight. Everyone thought Chris needed to rely on the wrestling, but Silva was doing a lot of taunting and goaded him into a striking battle on the feet. All before a fatal blow was landed, and suddenly the unbeatable Anderson Silva was knocked out.
Oh my goodness! He has done it!
What a way to start 2013, eh? Dethroning one of the longest reigning pound-for-pound best. It also ended one debate. GSP was now obviously number one. He'd been holding onto his UFC title for 6 years at this point. But of course, one way or another, no championship reign can last forever, and in November, GSP faced the toughest fight he'd ever go through when he went up against Johnny Hendricks. Everyone called this guy Big Rig, not just because he was fighting out of Texas, but because he had one-punch KO power as well as an incredibly credentialed collegiate wrestling background. Honestly, the perfect combination to take on GSP. The champ was still the favourite, but at just minus 220, it was the closest the odds had been in 4 years. The challenger matched the champion at every turn, and the more the fight wore on, the more he started to bust up the face of this unbeatable champion. When the final bell rang, Joe Rogan kind of said what everyone was thinking.
What a fight. I think we may have a new welterweight champion.
But the judges didn't see it that way. George's hand was raised, much to the disagreement of many people, including Dana White. Either way, GSP would walk away from the division and the UFC at this point, leaving his place as pound for pound number one regardless. 2013, like I said though, was full of surprises. A month before GSP had fought Johnny Hendricks, Jon Jones had faced Alex Gustafsson in his 5th title defense. And it was an incredibly tough fight, where for the first time, Jon was made to look human. He actually faced adversity in the extremely durable Swede and only turned the fight around in the championship rounds. He'd still won though, controversially. Jon Jones was now the pound for pound number one fighter on the planet. But before we move on, we've now got to talk about the women. In 2013, Ronda Rousey officially arrived in the UFC and was immediately made the bantamweight champion. Now, of course, women's MMA was going on way before this. From 2004 to 2010, a Japanese fighter by the name of Megumi Fujii had won 22 fights in a row before finally losing in the finals of the Bellator strawweight tournament. She was looked at as the best pound-for-pound female fighter for a number of years. Of course, from round about the time she lost in Bellator, Cyborg had also established herself as an absolute force to be reckoned with. By 2010, Cyborg could not have looked any scarier. She'd won 10 fights in a row, 8 of them by knockout, and was the Strikeforce Women's Featherweight Champion, having a massive fight with Gina Carano in the process. But shortly after, well, she tested positive for steroids, and we wouldn't see her fight again for another 2.5 years, removing herself from any pound-for-pound discussion. So, in her absence, the attention in women's MMA in Strikeforce went from bantamweight champion Marloes Coenen to the cupcake Miocic Tate, who dethroned her, which led right into a rivalry with the rising Ronda Rousey, who beat Miocic, took her belt, and in 2013 arrived in the UFC as the best pound-for-pound women's fighter. Of course, 2 months after Ronda's debut, Cyborg came back to competition, and who was going to be pound for pound the best was debated between the two of them from there. So that's where we're going to start with our pound for pound women being tested as we go into 2014. So, like I said, Jon Jones is the only long-standing champ remaining with GSP and Silva gone. He wasn't really tested in 2014. I mean, he only had one fight against Glover Teixeira, who everyone thought would be his toughest challenge, but Bones didn't really have any problems in that one. At the same time, Rousey was just stacking up title defenses as the new UFC champion. Both times she defended the belt that year, she absolutely rolled her opponents, so not a test for the women's pound for pound, and Cyborg didn't even fight that year. Which was good, probably, because 2015, this year started off in a big way. In January, one of the most anticipated bad blood and hyped rivalries of all time between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier went down. Again, everyone thought that if anyone was going to beat Jon, it was going to be DC, who'd looked flawless in his MMA career up until that point. But actually, once again, Jon came in with a pretty much perfect game plan. Jon took a unanimous decision, and there wasn't that much close about it. No, the real battle for Jon actually came a few months later. April came round and Jon was booked to fight Rumble Johnson, big knockout artist and a new challenge, but of course that fight, it never happens. News broke that Jon had been involved in a hit-and-run incident, not behaviour befitting of a UFC champion, and he was stripped of his belt and suspended indefinitely from fighting or defending his pound-for-pound number one ranking. Which meant there was a spot at the top for someone to slide up, and it went to Jose Aldo. At this point, the Brazilian champ hadn't lost in 9 years and had dominantly defended the UFC title 7 times. He was also the top choice because he just looked on another level compared to the rest of his division for such a long time. But also, at this point, you had Demetrious Johnson as well. Some people might have picked him as the new pound-for-pound best without Johnny Bones around, and it would have been warranted. The guy had 6 defenses as well, and in the same month Jones was arrested, he'd picked up another submission win while defending his belt. Either way, it was only Jose Aldo who was tested tested that year. And to be honest, guys, I'm being pretty liberal with the word tested. I mean, his mental fortitude and confidence was tested all year long in the lead up to the fight with Conor McGregor in December. And McGregor did everything he could to get in the champ's head. In 2015, it was, without a doubt, one of the most hyped fights of all time. But in the actual fight, well, Aldo was tested for the whole of 13 seconds. And sadly for him, he failed, leaping right at Conor, and he got knocked out cold. Once again, the pound-for-pound best had fallen. So with Jon Jones still out, Jose Aldo now unconscious, I mean, Conor McGregor wanted to be pound-for-pound number one, at least in his eyes, I'm sure he was. But on the men's side of things, Demetrious Johnson was the most deserving, and he's now the new pound-for-pound number one. But what about the women? Well, if you had Cris Cyborg as best on the planet in 2015, she just ran through another two girls in 45 seconds. But for Ronda Rousey, it was the year her entire life came crashing down. One of the most notorious combat sports athletes of all time, Holly Holm, a champion boxer and kickboxer, had made it to the UFC. Although she was incredibly hyped on her arrival, she didn't exactly impress with her first two UFC opponents, and so the odds were massively in the favor of the women's pound-for-pound Ronda when they fought. Ronda ended up chasing Holly all around the ring. There was nothing she could do but basically run into punches until she was absolutely decapitated in the second round.
Holly Holm is the new UFC bantamweight champion of the world! Oh my God!
The sky kind of fell down in 2015. No more Jon Jones, no more Jose Aldo, and no more Ronda Rousey. Whatever the heck was going to happen in 2016, it had a lot of holes to fill. Either way, at this point in time, it's Demetrious Johnson on the men's side of things, and from the women, well, you still had Cyborg or the strawweight champion, Joanna Jędrzejczyk. She'd been killing it with 3 title defenses already under her belt. Either way, that brings us to 2016. For the women, all attention is drawn to Cris Cyborg as she finally makes her UFC debut in May. Of course, for some reason, there was still this belief she could make 135, so the first 2 fights are catchweight fights at 140, and Cris still absolutely killed the competition, even if she had to kill herself to make weight. She beat Leslie Smith and then Lena Landsberg, and again, it wasn't even close. Joanna, on the other hand, had another title defense and had a great scrap with a fellow countrywoman, Karolina Kowalkiewicz. But aside from one round where she got tagged, you wouldn't really call that much of a test either. Now, Jon Jones does come back to the UFC this year as well. We'd not seen him since the Cormier fight at the start of 2015. Daniel had been holding on to the title, so it only made sense to book them in a fight. But twice it fell apart, most famously at UFC 200 with a failed drug test. Which meant the main event of UFC 200 turned out to be Amanda Nunes winning over Miocic Tate. What does that all mean? Demetrious Johnson is basically still at the top of most people's pound-for-pound lists, and guess what? For the first time in fucking ages, he was actually tested that year. By December, a season of The Ultimate Fighter had finished, one that threw all the flyweight champions from other organizations together to find one winner that DJ would fight. What do you know? That turned out to be Tim Elliott, a guy who'd already been in the UFC with less than stellar success, but somehow he put the champion in all kinds of trouble.
Boy, this is tight! Tim Elliott trying to shock the world here!
It was by far in ages the most difficulty we'd seen DJ in, but ultimately he won a pretty dominant decision. So December ended with DJ still the dominant champion he had been, now on an 11-fight win streak. Let's roll into 2017. And it's basically another flawless year for Demetrious Johnson. Between Wilson Hayes and Ray Borg, DJ basically flies through his contenders yet again, not tested, not even a pop quiz for that man. Now, Jon Jones does come back briefly in 2017, and after he beats Daniel Cormier in the rematch and reclaims his light heavyweight title, he had to go right back to the top of the pound-for-pound list. Except, oh wait, he tested positive for steroids, he again had his title stripped away from him, and we wouldn't see him back in the cage for a year and a half. The girls, though, well, there's a bit of a shake-up in the pound-for-pound spots as well, and it all starts with Joanna facing Rose Namajunas. Now, again, it's worth pointing out that Joanna champion is at this point 14-0. She's never struggled with any contender, not really. Her Muay Thai has been light years ahead of the rest of the girls, but that was all about to be tested by the young Thug Rose, who'd made herself a fan favorite with her ice-cold demeanor and submissions. Most fans thought the battle was kind of already won for Joanna. She'd done her best to intimidate Rose at the weigh-ins, but guys, the fucking atmosphere before this fight was absolutely insane. These two ladies went right at it, exchanging combos on the feet, which was kind of surprising for everyone watching.
Can Rose hang with one of the best kickboxers on the planet Earth?
And then out of nowhere, Rose dropped the champ.
Oh! Another knockdown!
Where under an assault of punishment, she was made to quit and tapped to strikes.
Dog Rose! Dog Rose!
Joanna had been undefeated, looked at as one of the most dominant champions still holding onto a belt, of course, but if you didn't realize at this point in the video, everyone loses eventually. Just 1 month before that had all gone down though, another high-profile women's fight had taken place. Remember I mentioned Amanda Nunes? Well, going into 2017, she'd battered 2 of the previous UFC champions, but her closest fight in the UFC so far had been against Valentina Shevchenko, and that had happened just a few months before Amanda won the belt at UFC 200. Now, in 2017, Shev was ready to go again, this time for the title. We're not going to get into too much of the struggle for this one, as most people saw Joanna as the pound-for-pound best until she'd lose just 1 month after this. But Nunes and Shevchenko had about as close of a fight as you can possibly get. Nunes got tested everywhere, on the feet, on the ground. It was a split decision, and I mean, watching it back, I still think Valentina won. But Nunes was given the official nod, and with Joanna being defeated just the month before, Amanda slid into 2018 as the new best women's pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. Of course, Chris Cyborg was still on a 20-fight unbeaten streak, so who was actually the best would be settled next year. Speaking of that, what happens in 2018? Well, like I said, DJ is still at the top of the men's pound-for-pound list going into the new year, but that was all going to change. Not because he'd lose, but because basically some other crazy shit happened. Still, with no sight of Jon Jones and with 2 title defenses under his belt, Daniel Cormier does some pound-for-pound shit. He goes up to heavyweight to try and become the second champ in UFC history. It was a big ask for him to meet Stipe Miocic in his own weight class, a guy who in 2018 held the record for the most defenses ever of the heavyweight title, and he'd knocked out 5 heavyweight world champions in a row getting there. It's important to remember all of that because it's those achievements that actually pushed Daniel Cormier to the #1 pound-for-pound spot. In July of 2018, a super fight was booked between the 2 divisional champions. Everyone was ready for a war, but it ended in just 4.5 minutes. DC landed the perfect right hand, knocking out the longest reigning heavyweight champ. Holy fucking shit. 2 belts, and he did it putting away the greatest ever. Yeah, okay, Daniel Cormier gets catapulted to the top of the men's pound-for-pound after this. He'd cement his spot even further as well by defending his heavyweight title against Derek Lewis just a few months later. Khabib's run at lightweight climaxes as the epic fight between him and Conor McGregor finally goes down. It's the biggest selling pay-per-view of all time, but even with a win, Khabib doesn't pass DC in the pound-for-pound list. It was his first defense after all. Another man floating around the top though, Demetrious Johnson, faces his toughest test ever, where he has to rematch Henry Cejudo. At this point, Henry had reinvented his style, improved his game, and could match DJ for 25 minutes. They traded on the feet, exchanged in the grappling, and it's one of the highest paced fights of all time. DJ's unbeaten run, though, is finally ended after 6 years at the top. By the end of the year, though, he'd be gone from the UFC entirely, heading to one championship, and he'd never appear on the pound-for-pound rankings again. And then right at the very end of the year, Jon Jones comes back in December after a 1.5 years off to fight Alexander Gustafsson for the vacant title that DC has now dropped. Jon wins in impressive fashion, and you might put him back at the top of the pound-for-pound list, but he wasn't really challenged by Alex in the rematch. Jon looks better though than he has done in the last 3 years, but according to the UFC rankings and the Wayback Machine, DC stayed at #1. Of course, on the same night Jon fought Gus, we also had a female showdown like never before. Like I said, it was now between Nunes and Cyborg as to who was actually the best pound-for-pound and probably the greatest women's fighter of all time. If you were there to see it, you'll know it's the culmination of 10 years of domination from Cyborg, coming head-to-head with Nunes, who'd beaten every other champion there had ever been in that weight class. Both girls were also champions in the UFC. Nunes were going for champ, and both girls had the skill set to really test each other. They came in, no fucks given, and just started swinging to decide immediately who was the best in the chaos of fighting. That's when Amanda landed the perfect right hand and knocked out Cyborg. Hands down, she was the best women's fighter ever. And that takes us into 2019, where despite some incredible performances by other champs, DC is still #1 pound-for-pound. Jon Jones comes back in 2019 though and fights 2 times, more than he has ever fought since 2013. The first against Anthony Smith, again, wasn't too much of a challenge for Jon, and then a few months later he defended against Thiago Santos. Now in that fight, Jon got chased all around the cage. He got blasted with power kicks and big punches, and it felt like he was just surviving at some points. Jon managed to get a very close decision, but it did nothing for him in the pound-for-pound rankings. Now, a little later in the year, Khabib had another title defense against the interim champ Dustin Poirier. But like a lot of Khabib fights, it wasn't really that much of a test either. Not the kind of thing that would see him pass DC in the pound for pound rankings anyway. The only fight that made sense for Cormier was the rematch with Stipe. The first one had ended pretty quickly after all, and this time they really got into it. I mean, it was a back and forth war for 4 freaking rounds.
I mean, this is a grueling fight. This is not easy by any stretch of the imagination.
DC was getting tired, Miocic was beaten up, but that's when Stipe started slamming Cormier's body.
Oh, another hard left-handed body.
He kept ripping the left hook, and it opened up DC for a finishing blow.
He is down! That's it! Stipe down!
For the first time in a year, Cormier slipped from his position as the #1 pound for pound and gave it up to once again his old rival, Jon Jones. Despite the performances, Bones still had an undeniable legacy and retook his seat on the pound for pound throne. And then, of course, right at the end of the year, Amanda Nunes has another title defense at bantamweight, a rematch against Germaine de Randamie, and it's actually a lot closer than people thought it was going to be. I mean, when it came to the stand-up, GDR actually won a lot of the exchanges and forced the champ to use her grappling. When she did, she picked up a unanimous decision in that one, also ending a 3-fight finishing streak. And so, 2020 begins, with Johnny Jones back on top, and he jumps right into action in February, making another defense against Dominic Reyes. Now again, this was a challenger that everyone thought had been kind of rushed to a title shot, but he gave John all he could handle. The first 3 rounds, Reyes was all over the pound for pound best, landing big left hands, kicks, stalking the champ and making him fight for every square meter in the octagon. By the time it came down to the judges, it honestly felt like Jones may have just lost for the first time. But the decision went his way. The fans were booing, Reyes couldn't believe it, but Jon Jones was still the champion and still the #1 pound for pound, even if he didn't really look like it. By August though, Jon and the UFC's back and forth negotiations ended with him vacating the light heavyweight title in a move up to heavyweight that would take a long time to get going. Someone we've not mentioned yet, Henry Cejudo, had won 2 belts in 2 different weight classes, and he was hovering around the #3 pound for pound spot. He beat Dominic Cruz in May, meaning he legitimately could have been considered pound for pound #1 by the time Jon disappeared on hiatus, but Henry also retired after that win and was no longer in the rankings by this point. And so the #1 spot goes to a guy who's been at #2 for almost 2 years at this point, Khabib Nurmagomedov. By 2020, Khabib was 28-0 and had already defended his UFC belt twice, basically running through all the competition he faced. In October, the Eagle puts on another spectacular performance against Justin Gaethje, and after he beats the highlight, guess what? Khabib retires from the sport on the spot, and that's the second guy to do that in a single year. So in 2020, 3 potential #1 pound for pound guys all disappear from the rankings. Meanwhile, Amanda Nunes destroys another contender and doesn't really face any adversity this year either. And for the men, it left just 2 names who could hold the pound for pound #1 spot, Israel Adesanya and Kamaru Usman. Both guys defended their belts pretty easily that year though, so that takes us into 2021, where both champs were tested. First up was Usman in February, who had his long-awaited match with his former teammate Gilbert Burns. Now this one got pretty emotional, but also pretty damn exciting quickly, as Gil blasted Kamaru in the first round. Usman had to compose himself, for sure, but was able to drain the life out of Burns and with some beautiful jabs set up an awesome TKO. Little bit scary there for Kamaru in that one. His chin definitely got tested, but what about Israel Adesanya? Well, he was about to have an even rougher time. By 2021, you could look at the middleweight division and say that Izzy had pretty much cleaned it out. The opportunity was there without Jon Jones at 205 anymore to move up and go for a second belt, and the man he'd have to beat was the new champ Jan Blachowicz. On paper, it seemed like they matched up pretty well. Izzy was certainly way higher than Jan on the pound for pound rankings, but the Polish champ, he gave Adesanya all he could handle. His striking defense was on point, and he just shut the middleweight champion down. And in his back pocket, he had the wrestling, and combined with his bigger size, he took a solid decision from Izzy. After that loss, well, it's pretty definitive that Kamaru Usman becomes the new pound for pound #1, right? Should probably mention, though, this year as well, Alexander Volkanovski is starting to stack up title defenses at featherweight. A lot of people looked at what he'd done so far at this point, the quality of his performances. He might be your pound for pound even now in 2021. And he did kind of get tested that year as well. Well, he had a defense against the super dangerous Brian Ortega. He put the champ in some terrible submissions, even an iconic guillotine, and the escape from that almost defined Volk's career at that point. Also, something crazy happened with the women's pound for pound. Nunes has a title defense that we all think is going to be pretty easy against Juliana Pena. But somehow, for that girl, the stars aligned. She'd been waiting so long to get a shot, and she made the most of it. Early on in the fight, she rocked Amanda Nunes and caught her in chaotic exchanges that she was able to win. Then when she sunk in the choke, everyone was losing their minds. Unbelievable win over the pound for pound best. Nunes is finally beaten, and it opens the way for Valentina Shevchenko to take over as the new best girl on the planet. Pretty hard to deny her at this point, as she is on 6 defenses herself, heading into the next year, 2022. So it's still really between 2 guys, Kamaru Usman and Volkanovski. Alex manages to get 2 more defenses this year before Kamaru fights, and both of them are pretty dominant performances. Honestly, Volk has never looked better at this point, and he's just one of those fighters who can do everything, and it feels like the guy's got 0 weaknesses. Usman, on the other hand, is about to, unfortunately, lose everything. After cycling through some of the same contenders, Kamaru was up against another rematch and another fight everyone thought he was going to win. Kamaru had previously dominated Leon Edwards with his wrestling when they met very early on in their careers, and everyone pretty much thought that was going to happen when they fought for the title. The first round, though, was actually pretty close, and it was Leon who took the champ down and started controlling him. But the next 3 rounds saw him getting bullied by Kamaru. It all came down to the final 90 seconds. Leon was completely out of the fight. Kamaru was about to cruise to a dominant decision when a head kick was fired, and it flatlined the pound for pound best on the planet. Another pound for pound legacy was over. Usman had been at the top for a while, but there was no coming back from that one, which pushed Volkanovski to the new #1 pound for pound best. And he'd have 2 more fights that year, but wasn't really tested. It was more dominance for Volk. He defended against the Korean Zombie in a bit of a slaughter, and then definitively put a stamp on the trilogy with Max Holloway 0-3ing him. But then, of course, for the very first time, Valentina Shevchenko is tested. That 6 title fight defense streak I was talking about got a new challenge in Talia Santos. Not many people thought too much of her as a challenge. They thought it was going to be another dominant performance, but the people in the know recognized that Santos was very well-rounded and could challenge the champ in all areas. And you know what? She bloody did. In the first round, she had Shev's back and was trying to squeeze the life out of her.
This is amazing! Got the back, got the neck crank so far!
The challenger got top position in round 2. She was able to hang on the feet and several times had her in positions where it looked like it might be over. Still, it wasn't enough on the judges' scorecards to beat the pound for pound #1, even though I and many other people thought it had been. But it did turn out to be enough to unseat her from the pound for pound spot, especially because by the end of the year, Nunes came back and ran through Pena, so she moved past Valentina right back to the #1 spot. At the end of 22, it's Volkanovski sitting at #1 and a new #2 has risen, Islam Makhachev. He spent the year fulfilling father's plan, beating Charles Oliveira and claiming the lightweight title. #1 and #2 going into 2023, and we were again about to have a historic matchup. Islam wanted the pound for pound #1 spot, and the only way to prove he deserved it, he thought, was to beat Alexander Volkanovski. It just felt like perfect timing for both guys. Sure, Islam hadn't defended the title, but who didn't want to see the #1 versus the #2 pound for pound go at it? And both guys were tested like never before. Alex connected in the first round. But Makhachev was able to slow it down, latch on, and control him. They went back and forth for 5 amazing rounds, and it was way closer than a lot of people thought it was going to be. And even with just 1 minute left, the pound for pound #1 dropped #2. I know most people watching this video will have an opinion on who actually won this fight. I mean, it was truly a test for both guys to see who was the #1 pound for pound. And the result was kind of strange. Makhachev officially won the fight, but didn't move past Alex to the #1 spot. The lighter champ had come up a weight class and given Islam a run for his money. He'd even won the moral victory by dropping him in the closing minutes of the fight. But now, Volkanovski was still #1. But that would not last long at all, because for the first time since 2020, Jon Jones comes back to the UFC. Not just that, the guy was finally going up to heavyweight to face a former interim champion, Ciryl Gane. Jon looked a lot beefier at this weight class, but would he still fight the same? Turns out he looked even fucking better. Took him just 2 minutes to slice through Gane like a warm baguette, and he squeezed the life out of him. With that flawless performance, Jon Jones goes straight back to number 1 on the pound-for-pound rankings, at least according to the UFC, because it's just 3 months after that Volkanovski comes back to defend his featherweight belt, beats the brakes off Yair Rodriguez, and has a pretty good argument to get his number 1 spot back. What ends up happening instead, though, kinda just ruins all of that. Islam Makhachev's next title defense falls out on short notice, and Volk, being the guy that he is, agrees to a rematch, full of confidence that this time he'll get the win. But that's not what happens at all. Makhachev looks as flawless as Jon did. In just 3 minutes, he finds his kill shot and removes Volkanovski from his consciousness and from the pound-for-pound conversation. Islam Makhachev officially moves to number 1 in most people's books. He's just looked too good as a competitor up to this point to be anything less. Of course, 2023 is the year that Amanda Nunes also retires, ending her historic career, and is no longer the pound-for-pound number 1. Now, you think that would go to Shevchenko, but she just lost her belt to Alexa Grasso 2 months before. Some people might look at Weili Zhang at this point as the new women's pound-for-pound, but she wouldn't defend her belt until August, where she quite handily took out Amanda Lemos. Officially, Alexa Grasso ends 2023 as the best pound-for-pound woman on the planet. And so that leaves us here in 2024, where the pound-for-pound debate is kind of up in the air. On the one hand, you've got Dana White telling anyone who will listen that Jon Jones is the number 1 pound for pound. Based on legacy and overall career achievements, okay, but as you can tell from this list, that's never really what the pound for pound has been about. That's a GOAT conversation. Pound for pound is an active ranking, kind of a hard argument to make for someone who's only fought once since 2020. So despite Dana's opinion, Jon is currently ranked number 3 on UFC.com. Will the Stipe fight change that? Probably not. At number 2, it's Alex Pereira, the light heavyweight champion. In 2023, his name didn't really come up on the pound-for-pound list. I mean, he beat Jan and then Yuri Prohaska to win the title, but he was still building into the star he's become. This year, of course, he headlined UFC 300, got a 3-minute knockout over the former champ, and if that wasn't impressive enough, he was able to knock out Yuri again. All those performances have made him look, well, like the deadliest striker on planet Earth. Of course, number 1 right now is Islam Makhachev, and to be honest, I thought Dustin Poirier in June gave him a pretty solid run for his money, but ultimately, the smash was still mostly dominant. Islam got another submission victory and just showed more of why he's so highly ranked. The question is, who can test him at this stage? Arman and Oliveira would both be rematches that would probably be a bet for his best test. Recently, we just saw Alexa Grasso lose her title in the rematch to Valentina, which once again puts her back at the top of the pound-for-pound list. What's next for her, though? Who knows? I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Valentina fight Zhang, to be honest. That would be fucking great. And so, that's where we are, guys. After a 31-year-long journey, what was the craziest twist here in your mind? And which dethroning had your jaw hitting the floor more than any others? All right. This was a serious undertaking, this video, or the entire history of MMA, basically, year by year, but we've done it for you, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you bloody learned something as well, otherwise I feel like a terrible teacher of history. I have to give a massive shout out to Luke, okay, the boy, the editor, cool2me_. Give him a special thank you as well, guys, because you cannot imagine how difficult it was to edit this video, to put it all together. Definitely a big task that he completed. So if you liked it, show him some love, guys, all right? All of you channel members out there and Hall of Famers, thank you, guys. We appreciate that support you give us. It helps these kind of videos get made. So if you like these videos and you want to join them and keep supporting, you can check out the link down below in the description. There's tons of benefits as well to signing up to the members program, so check those out if you're interested. If you want to show some extra appreciation, of course, the thumbs up button is right there, so you can say, I like this video. And if you're new here, you can subscribe, get updated every time we drop a video. You'll never miss one. And another one. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. Big video. Appreciate it. There's more coming. I'm going to make these even longer. They'll be 10 hours long.